Today we are going to explore conditional probability. To get the most out of this lesson, I will ask you to pause and think at certain points, so be ready for that and to write down your thoughts. First, I want you to pause and read the information here. Once you've read it, press play. Press pause now. All right, before we get to a question about this data, let's organize it into a two-way table and a Venn diagram. So I want you to complete your own on your paper. All right, now check your work. So now let me ask you a question about this data. Pause here and try to answer on your paper before you continue. So if I know the person chose queso, that means I'm no longer dealing with the entire 50 people. I'm only looking at these 30 people who I know chose queso. And then I want to know what's the probability out of that group that the person will also choose guacamole. So now if I look in either visual here, I can find the number that would choose guacamole as well. And that would be 13. So let's set up a ratio or a fraction. We have 13 out of our total 30 who chose queso. So we could also write this as a percent or as a decimal. What we're saying here is that a person who chooses queso has a 43.33% chance of also choosing guacamole. Let's look at one other way you may have thought about this question. Maybe you went ahead and turned each of these groups into their individual probabilities. So I got these numbers in red here by dividing each group number by 50 because that was the total number of people that we started with. Now we can still use these individual probabilities and set up a ratio. If we look at the people who chose queso, we can add these two groups together to get 6/10. And then we look out of that group, what's the likelihood that someone would also pick guacamole? Well, they're represented here with 26/100. Again, and we still find that same answer of 43.33%. I haven't asked you to use any formulas or anything. I just want you thinking about the problem, just making sense of it. So let's try one more. Just pause and look through this information. Okay, next let's organize it into a Venn diagram and a two-way table. So pause again, and then when you're ready to move on, click play. Okay, go ahead and check your work here. Be sure you have it all organized correctly. Now here's my question. So pause here, try to answer it on your own using any method you choose. All right, so this time we're only looking at the people who chose sprinkles for our total group. And out of that group, the probability that they will also choose syrup, and that's represented here by the 51. So let's set up a ratio. Our total group here, 51 and 44, or if we look up here in our table, 95. And out of that group, the people who also chose chocolate syrup would be 51. To get 537 thousandths, we'll round off there, or 53.7%. Let's say you had converted the individual groups into decimals. You would have done that by dividing by 200, since that was our total group this time. If you had those decimals, you could use those again, set up a ratio, and still get the same answer. Okay, let's back up and take what we did kind of intuitively, and let's come up with the actual formula for conditional probability, and let's talk about the proper notation. When we're talking about probability, we have events. Let's call choosing queso event A and choosing guacamole event B. Our problem here, we were given that the person had already chosen queso. So given event A has happened, what is the probability that event B will happen? If we're going to write this with the proper notation, we would write it like this: the probability of B given A. So what's the probability that someone chooses guacamole given that they have chosen queso? And if we look at how we found our answer here, we can come up with the formula. In the numerator, we want the probability of A and B, or the intersection. If we look at our Venn diagram, that's represented here in the middle. And then for our denominator, we want the probability of A. That's the entire event here, and we needed to add these numbers together to get our denominator. And when we divide those, we get our percent, or our decimal, or the probability of B given A. Let's see if our second example follows that same formula. The probability of B given A. Now we need to be careful here. B given A, which one was given in this problem? In this case, we're given that the person has chosen sprinkles. So we want to be sure that our given is still A. Then we can still follow this same format. The probability of the intersection of A and B, that's represented in the middle, divided by the probability of A, which is this total group of people who chose sprinkles. Now that you have a formula you can follow, it can make the process a lot quicker, but don't hesitate to just stop and think about the problem you're given and see if you can solve it intuitively. Last, I want to leave you with a couple things to think about on your own.